A lowly physician's assistant, with no wolf scent, no bloodline, no name worth remembering. That was all Maria was supposed to be. Invisible, forgettable, safe. But the king of Ethelgard, the most powerful alpha in the northern realm, had a habit of walking past the apothecary door at odd hours for no reason anyone could explain. And when a conspiracy tore through the royal court, a gilded chalice, a powder designed to strip every disguise down to bone, Maria was the one dragged to the center of Parliament's floor and forced to drink. What no one knew was what lived beneath her human face. Ancient blood, dragon wings, a scorpion tail that carried both death and its antidote. A chimera, the last of her kind. A creature that 7-year-old Maria had once nearly been burned alive for being. Now the king was dying, poisoned by the very conspiracy that had just ripped her secret open in front of 300 drawn swords. And the only thing standing between Aldric and death was the monster kneeling at his feet. So why, when the wings tore free and the court screamed, did he take 3 steps toward her instead of away? Watch till the end, because this story is only just beginning. Prologue: The Oath Ceremony. The chalice was gilded. That was the first thing Maria noticed, the obscene gold of it, catching torchlight as though it wanted to be admired. Her knees were cold through the stone. Parliament's great hall held the bite of early winter even in May, its vaulted ceiling drinking warmth before it could reach the floor. She was kneeling at the center of it, wrists bound behind her with iron cord, and 300 pairs of eyes were watching her, the way wolves watch something already caught. Breathe, she told herself. Just breathe. She could not smell anything except iron and the expensive perfume of Seraphina, who stood 2 steps away with an expression like a woman unwrapping a gift she'd purchased for herself. The court of Ethelgard does not tolerate deception, Duke Valerius's voice carried effortlessly, a voice built for crowded rooms and quiet executions. He descended the dais steps with the unhurried pace of a man entirely certain of his outcome. We have among us a creature of unknown origin, sheltered in our halls, permitted intimacy with our king. A creature that has hidden its true nature behind a human face. He stopped before her. Up close, his eyes were pale, nearly colorless, and very intelligent. Drink, he said, extending the chalice. Maria looked past him. At the far end of the hall, Aldric sat on his throne. Or, rather, Aldric was propped on his throne, his knuckles white on the carved armrests, his jaw a locked gate. He was sweating through his ceremonial collar. 48 hours of the black-veined fever had carved hollows beneath his eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. And still, he held himself upright through what had to be sheer refusal to do otherwise. His gaze found hers across the distance. She looked away first. Don't, she thought. Don't you dare get up. The chalice rim touched her lower lip, cold and precise, and Valerius tilted it. She swallowed. For 3 heartbeats, nothing. Then it began in her spine, a cracking sensation, as though something that had been compressed for years was being pried apart by patient hands. The pain did not build. It simply arrived, complete and total, radiating outward through every layer of her. Her mouth opened. She heard herself gasp. The disguise, 23 years of careful, unconscious maintenance, shredded like wet parchment. The first thing to go was the sound of her own breathing, replaced by something deeper, resonant in a way human lungs were never meant to be. Then her back. God, her back. As the wings tore free of the glamour that had held them folded for so long that she'd nearly forgotten they existed. 12 feet of them. Pale as moonlight on frost, the leading edges darkening to a blue-black where dragon scale met air. Someone screamed. 300 swords came out of their sheaths in one terrible chord of sound. And there, on the floor of Parliament's great hall, kneeling in her shredded attendant's uniform, with her wings spread wide enough to shadow the nearest torches, Maria raised her head and found Aldric still watching her. His expression had not changed. His hands were shaking. She couldn't tell which one of them she was more afraid of. From the throne, the king said nothing. He breathed. She breathed. The court held its collective breath between them. Then she heard the exact sound of Aldric beginning to rise from his throne, despite the fever, despite Valerius's soldiers, despite everything. And the roar that left her chest was not the sound of a wolf. Chapter 1. The Origin and the Shield. 8 months earlier, the palace herb stores smelled of fennel and dried bloodwort, and the specific damp that accumulated in stone buildings that had stood since the previous century. Maria had been doing inventory for 3 hours, and she was approximately 1 misplaced jar of wolfsbane away from losing her composure entirely. 3 bundles of yarrow. 2 of... 2? She counted again. 2 of yarrow, 1 of... Where is the... The door swung open. She didn't look up. The junior apothecary assistants had developed the habit of forgetting to knock, and she'd learned that reacting with anything sharper than patience only extended the duration of the interaction. "Oh," said a voice she recognized. "Still counting." "Still counting," she confirmed, moving a jar of dried chamomile to make room for the yarrow she'd apparently miscounted. Her shoulder blades tightened with the particular tension that accompanied Lady Isidora's visits, but she kept her attention on the shelf. "Was there something you needed, my lady?" "We needed to pass through," Isidora said sweetly. "The western corridor is blocked." This was a lie. The western corridor was never blocked. But Maria had learned, at 13, at 15, at 17, and again at 23, that arguing the point was a longer road than simply waiting for it to be over. She heard the door open wider. She heard the 3 of them come in. Isidora and her pair of attendants, the ones who moved through the palace like they were evaluating it for purchase. She did not hear the moment they decided to move toward the shelf where her morning's gathering sat in a wicker basket. But she heard the moment the basket hit the floor, the crack of dried herbs against stone, the soft scatter of petals. "Oh, how careless," Isidora said. Maria was still for the length of 1 breath. Then she turned. The basket lay on its side. Isidora's slipper rested on what had been, 4 seconds ago, a careful bundle of meadowsweet that Maria had gathered at dawn specifically because the palace supply was low and the king's physician had requested it. "There's nothing to be done about it," Isidora continued, her voice carrying the gentle finality of someone concluding an argument she'd already won. "After all, a girl with no wolf scent crawling through the king's herb stores. One wonders how it's been permitted this long." She paused. "Wolfless. Scentless. I've always thought it was unnatural." The word landed the way it always did, like something placed deliberately, meant to sit. Maria crouched and began to gather the scattered herbs. "Leave them," Isidora said. "They've touched the floor, worthless now." "The meadowsweet is intact." Maria's voice was even. She had spent a great deal of her life perfecting the evenness of her voice. "And the physician needs—" "I said, leave them. The meadowsweet before this evening, so I'll leave them." The door opened. Not the door Maria had come in through, the north door, the one that connected the herb stores to the upper corridor, the one that was used exclusively when the king was in this wing. Isidora went still. The 2 attendants went very still. Maria looked up from the floor, one hand closed around a bundle of bruised meadowsweet, and found herself looking at the King of Ethelgard, standing in the doorway, with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has just stepped into a room mid-sentence and understood every word of the preceding hour. Aldric was 25. He was, objectively, built on a scale that the door he stood in barely accommodated. Broad across the shoulder, the kind of height that made the crown he wasn't currently wearing seem redundant. His hair was dark, his jaw was the architectural kind, and he wore ceremony the way some men wore old coats. Like it had been tailored to him so long ago, he'd forgotten it was there. He was looking at the floor, at the scattered herbs, at Isidora's foot, still resting on the meadowsweet. "My king," Isidora said, and the sweetness had sharpened into something practiced and bright. "We were just—" "I can see what you were just." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet of it was somehow worse than volume would have been. His gaze moved from the floor to Isidora, with the careful, deliberate pace of something very large choosing where to step. "Pick them up." A pause. "I beg your pardon?" "The herbs." He uncrossed his arms. "Pick them up." The color drained from Isidora's face in stages. "My king, I hardly think—" "Every stem." He was already walking, not toward Isidora, but toward Maria, which meant Isidora and her attendants had to either stand their ground or give way. And the shape of his stride made clear that the question of which they chose was entirely their own problem. "Each one. Then you'll return them to their shelf." He stopped beside Maria, close enough that she could smell wood smoke and pine resin, and the cold that still clung to his coat from wherever he'd been. Outside, she thought, probably the training yard, which meant he'd been here before the herb stores and had come through the north door specifically. She did not let herself think about why. He reached down, not looking at her, and picked up 2 stems of yarrow from the floor beside her hand. He set them in her basket. Her chest did something she categorized quickly as irrelevant. Behind them, with the audible reluctance of women who knew they had lost and were only bargaining now for the terms of the loss, Isidora and her attendants began to crouch. Aldric kept his eyes on the shelf, ostensibly examining the inventory. "You gathered these today?" He held up a small jar, turned it once. "At dawn." She kept her voice clinical, professional. She was a physician's assistant doing inventory. This was a king conducting an inspection. Everything was as it should be. The meadowsweet supplies were low. Physician Aldric requested. Aldric mentioned it last week. He set the jar down. "You remembered?" She said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. Nothing that didn't involve dismantling the careful architecture of not thinking about the fact that he noticed when she remembered things. Beside her shoe, barely visible in the rushlight, a single bruised petal from the meadowsweet lay on the stone floor. She had missed it. Before she could reach for it, his boot shifted, not stepping on it, but settling beside it, angling toward it, until it was tucked safe from accidental crushing. The gesture was so small it might have been unconscious. She picked up the petal. Their hands did not touch. There was a full inch of air between them. Her heart didn't care about the distinction. When Isidora and her attendants had gone, their footsteps audible in the corridor long after the door closed, Aldric turned from the shelf and looked at her with the directness he had always had, the quality that made the court nervous and made Maria feel, irrationally, like she was being seen rather than evaluated. "If it happens again," he said, "come to me." "It would create more difficulty than it would solve," she said, which was honest, and then immediately added, "My king," which was belated and slightly absurd, given that they were alone in a room that smelled of dried flowers, and she was still holding a handful of bruised meadowsweet like evidence. The corner of his mouth did something. She chose not to catalogue what exactly. "It will happen again," he said. "Yes." "Then come to me anyway." He left through the north door. She stood in the quiet of the herb stores for a long moment, listening to the distant sound of the palace resuming its ordinary day, and thought very carefully about nothing at all. Chapter 2. The Broken Covenant. The letter arrived from the Northern Court on a Tuesday, sealed in blue wax, and by Thursday it had been read, argued over by 6 members of the Privy Council, drafted into a formal betrothal agreement, and laid before the king on the council chamber table. By Thursday afternoon, it was in pieces. Maria heard about it from Aldrich Jr., who had heard it from a kitchen boy, who had allegedly witnessed the king's response firsthand. Aldric had read the document once, looked up at the 6 waiting council members with an expression they declined to describe in detail, and then torn the letter in half. Then in quarters. Then, with a precision that several witnesses described as almost meditative, into 8ths. He said the throne was stable, the junior told her, wide-eyed. He said, and I'm quoting, that he had the right to choose his own Nornmate, and he intended to exercise it, and that any counselor who wished to contest that point was welcome to say so directly. None of them had. Maria absorbed this information, filed it in the section of her mind labeled "Not Your Concern," and went back to grinding the willow bark. She was still grinding it, mechanically, an hour later. The royal garden in late autumn was brown and sparse, the ornamental trees stripped to skeleton, the frost-killed herbs cut back to stubs. Maria had been sent to check the remaining cold-hardy rosemary. Aldric was obsessive about rosemary, and she was on her knees in the furthest section of the garden when she heard boots on the gravel path and realized, with a sensation somewhere between the heart and the sternum, that she'd failed to bring her medicine satchel. No satchel meant no plausible excuse for being here. No excuse meant, "The rosemary looks acceptable," Aldric said, stopping a few feet away. She sat back on her heels. He was in his off-duty coat, dark wool, no ceremony, his crown absent. He looked, without the formal trappings, slightly more human than usual, which was somehow worse. "Aldric wanted an assessment," she said. "Aldric knows what rosemary looks like. He worries." Aldric crouched beside her, which brought him to her level and shortened the distance between them, to something she was immediately aware of in her peripheral vision. He studied the low, silver-green sprig with the attentiveness of a man who was actually thinking about something else. "The throne of Ethelgard," he said after a moment, "requires a queen of the purest blood." Maria's hands went still on the rosemary. She did not look at him. She looked at the frost-edged soil, at the gray sky beginning to lower at the garden's edge, at the very specific and deeply interesting texture of the stone wall to her left. "A queen who carries something ancient in her," he continued, "something that runs truer than rank or title, something that cannot be performed." Serafina. The name settled in her chest like a stone dropped into cold water. Lady Serafina, with her pure-blooded wolf line that stretched back 8 generations, her silver eyes, her educated deportment. Of course the northern betrothal had been rejected. Not because Aldric objected to political marriage in principle, but because he'd already made his choice. "I see," Maria said. The words came out perfectly level. She was rather proud of them. She stood, brushed frost from her knees, and began to gather her materials with the systematic efficiency of someone concentrating very hard on a simple task. "Maria, I should return these notes to Aldric before the afternoon physician's rounds. Thank you for the conversation, my king." She walked away through the dead garden at a pace that was not fleeing, but was, structurally, the fastest non-fleeing pace available. Behind her she heard him. A single breath, controlled, like a man swallowing something that had risen in his throat. She did not turn back to see what expression accompanied it. Chapter 3. The Winter Hunt Festival. The festival began with snow. It came overnight, a proper first fall, 8 inches of it blanketing the palace grounds and the outer city in the kind of clean silence that made the world feel, briefly, deceptively forgiving. By dawn, the courtyard was full of horses being caparisoned in the royal colors, breath steaming in the cold, the huntsmen circling with the compressed energy of men who'd been waiting 3 months for this. Maria had been planning to observe the departure from the apothecary window, as she had done every year since arriving at the palace. She'd been doing very well with this plan until Aldric had appeared in the apothecary doorway with a bundled object under his arm, and Sir Tristan behind him, looking diplomatically at the ceiling. "You'll ride with us," Aldric said. "I have inventory," Aldric excused you. He set the bundle on the work table. It unfolded as silver white as the snow outside. Fox fur, long and extravagant. The kind of cloak that cost more than she made in a year. You'll be cold without it. She looked at the cloak. She looked at him. She looked at Tristan, who was very carefully studying a shelf of tincture bottles. You'll ride in front of me, Alaric added, with the manner of a man describing the weather. The road to the hunting grounds is poorly marked after snowfall. He was already leaving, as though the matter was resolved, as though she had agreed. She picked up the cloak. The fur was impossibly soft against her fingers, warmer than it had any right to be. She didn't let herself think about the fact that it smelled faintly of pine resin and wood smoke, the same cold outdoor scent she'd catalogued, carefully and against her better judgment, in the herb stores 3 months ago. She put the cloak on. Tristan finally looked away from the tinctures. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth did something that she chose charitably to interpret as a cough. Riding in front of Alaric was an act of sustained, highly professional composure. He controlled the horse from behind her, arms on either side of her to reach the reins, his chest a wall of warmth against her spine that the winter wind could not reach. She kept her back straight, her gaze forward, her hands in her lap, and thought very carefully about the medicinal properties of the plants they passed. Yarrow grew at elevation in these forests. Excellent styptic properties, useful in battle wounds, completely unrelated to the way the motion of the horse pressed her back against his chest every 3rd or 4th stride. Irrelevant to the warmth of his forearm, briefly, against her hip, when he turned the horse around a tree root. You're thinking about herbs, he said against her temple. His voice was lower at this distance, the vibration of it carrying differently. I'm always thinking about herbs. Even now? Especially now. She watched a red kite wheel overhead, distant. It's a useful habit. Are they helping? She said nothing. She felt, rather than heard, the sound he made. Not quite a laugh, somewhere short of it. The faintest press of his jaw against her hair, gone so quickly she could not have certified it had happened. And then he was looking forward again, and the horse was moving. Her heart was doing something impossible, and she was cataloguing Yarrow. The trouble with Valerius was that he was very good at timing. He found her during the half-hour of the midday rest, when the hunting party was dispersed across the forest's edge, and Alaric was occupied with a discussion that required, apparently, 30 feet of distance. Valerius appeared from the direction of the horse line as if by coincidence, and stood beside her with the companionable air of an uncle making conversation. You manage it well, he said. The performance. She kept her gaze on the tree line. My lord? The warmth. His voice was pleasant. Conversational. The attachment. It takes a certain talent, making a man believe it's genuine. He paused. Though I imagine you've had practice. Creatures like you often do. The word creatures was casual. That was the most important part. How casual it was, how little weight he put on it, as though it were merely descriptive. The king's interest in you is an embarrassment to the court, he continued. An amusement, perhaps, for a season. But a woman with no wolf scent, no bloodline, no traceable origin. She does not sit the queen's chair. She doesn't sit at the high table. She goes where shadow creatures go. Eventually. He glanced at her sidelong, that is, assuming her true nature never becomes relevant to anyone. He walked away before she could respond. Or perhaps she simply didn't respond. She wasn't entirely certain, afterward, which had happened. The snow under her boots was very white. The kite was gone from the sky. She was still standing there when Alaric came back and said, What did he say to you? Nothing of consequence, she said, and the evenness of her voice was the best thing she'd done all day. The fire that night was enormous, built up in the old way for the winter festival, orange-red against the black trees. The hunting party gathered around it in the satisfied sprawl of people who'd had a good day and were ready to enjoy the aftermath. Aldric sat on a log and pulled Maria down beside him with the matter-of-fact ease of a man who had decided something and was now simply enacting it. No negotiation. No announcement. The gesture was domestic and proprietary and public in a way that made every head in the vicinity rotate, and Maria had approximately 2 seconds to process this before he said, loudly enough to carry, "Maria is my mate and my queen. Anyone who has a concern about that can discuss it with Sir Tristan." Tristan, who had been mid-bite of a piece of bread, looked up with the expression of a man updating his professional expectations. The fire crackled. Sparks drifted upward. Maria was aware of approximately 40 people looking at her. She was aware of Aldric's shoulder against hers, solid and warm. She was aware of Serafina, 20 feet away in the firelight, going perfectly, statue still. She was aware that 300 years of fear, the village at the edge of the ashvale, the torches, her mother screaming, "Run," had just been given a new venue. She stood up. "Excuse me," she said, to no one in particular, and she walked into the dark between the trees. Behind her, Aldric said her name once. She didn't stop. The forest swallowed her, white and silent. Chapter 4. A Fateful Night. He found her in 3 minutes, because of course he did. The forest this far from the fire was blue dark, the snow luminous under a half-moon, the trees standing like witnesses. Maria had gotten as far as a fallen oak before her legs made the executive decision to stop, and she was sitting on it, with her hands in her lap, when she heard his boots in the snow. She didn't look up. "You ran," he said. He wasn't angry. He was something else. The something else in his voice was harder to categorize. "I walked with purpose." "You—" He stopped. He made the short sound she was beginning to recognize as him choosing a different approach mid-sentence. "Maria, look at me." She looked up. He was standing in the snow 6 feet from her, and the moonlight was doing something to his face that made it very difficult to maintain clinical distance. There was a raw quality to his expression. Not hurt, exactly, but the thing beneath hurt. The thing people only show when they've stopped performing composure. He went down on one knee, in the snow, full ceremony, his dark coat against the white ground. "I don't care about blood," he said. "I don't care about wolf-line or purebred claim, or any of the rest of the court's inventory of what a queen should be. I care that you were 13 years old and you stitched my shoulder in the dark without flinching. I care that you gathered the meadowsweet at dawn because the physician needed it. I care—" He stopped. Started again. "I am asking you to stay, properly, as mine." The silence was very large. Maria's chest was doing something she had no clinical vocabulary for. "I'm not—" she started. "Don't," he said. "Don't tell me what you're not. Tell me what you want." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. The arrow came from the left. She heard it before she saw it, the specific note of a loosed shaft in cold air, and she moved on instinct, throwing herself sideways, which meant the arrow that had been aimed at Aldric's exposed back instead caught the tree trunk 6 inches to his left. Then the men came out of the trees. 4 of them, crossbows and short blades, moving with the economical silence of professionals who'd been paid very well and told to leave no witnesses. Aldric was on his feet before the first one was fully clear of the tree line. She'd never seen him move like this. The shift from kneeling in the snow to combat ready was like watching a weather change, instantaneous. And the fight was fast and brutal, and over in under 2 minutes. 3 of them were down. The 4th was retreating. Maria did not consciously make a decision. She registered the retreating assassin, the drawn blade, the angle of approach toward Aldric's turned back, and something deep in her spine, older than thought, older than the careful human face she wore, responded. The tail that she had kept invisible since she was 7 years old, uncurled. It moved before she could stop it. The barbed tip caught the assassin across the forearm. He went down. Silence. Maria stood in the snow, with her tail still half extended, and the cold hitting her skin where her dress had torn at the spine. And she waited for the reaction, for the flinch, the step back, the reach for a weapon. She had been waiting for this reaction, in one form or another, since she was 7 years old. Aldric looked at the assassin, at her tail, still visible in the moonlight, at her face. "Are you hurt?" he said. She blinked. "Am I? Are you hurt from the fall?" He was already crossing the snow toward her, scanning her face with an efficiency that had nothing to do with the tail she was currently trying to retract, and everything to do with the question he just asked. She said, "No," automatically. He exhaled. Then he shrugged his coat off and put it around her shoulders, covering the torn back of her dress, and the warmth of it hit her so comprehensively. Coat warm, his warm, pine resin and wood smoke warm, that she was very nearly undone. "Good," he said, and went to check the downed assassin. He did not look at the claw marks on his shoulder, the ones that had appeared, she noticed now, not from the assassin's blade, but from the slight graze of her barb when she'd moved past him in the dark. He said nothing about them. He adjusted his collar and said nothing about them at all. He knows, she thought, watching him, and he's choosing. She held the coat around herself and watched him work, and did not yet understand what he was choosing to protect her from. Chapter 5. The Haunting. 3 days later, the king's physician came to her. He did not say much. He didn't have to. His face said it. The controlled, clinical blankness of a man delivering news he hasn't found the right container for yet. "His fever will not break," he said. "The blood—" "Show me," she said. The physician hesitated. She was a physician's assistant. She was not, technically, authorized. She had also been gathering herbs at dawn for this palace for 3 years, and had diagnosed 2 cases of river sickness before Aldric had. And they both knew it. He showed her. The blood on the physician's cloth was black. She recognized it the way you recognize something from a nightmare. The deep, oily darkness of it. The faint luminescence at the edges. She had seen this color once, in a text kept in the Forbidden Forest archive, written in the cramped hand of a scholar who had been documenting the properties of chimera-derived toxins, in the manner of someone who expected never to encounter one in practice. "No known antidote," the text had said. The venom metabolizes into the host's bloodline, seeking the heart. No recorded survivals. No recorded survivals. She excused herself from the physician's room with a composed face and went directly to the washroom at the end of the east corridor, where she sat on the cold floor for 10 minutes, pressing her back against the wall, breathing through the particular kind of panic that feels, from the outside, exactly like calm. It was her venom. Her graze in the forest. She had done this. She was still sitting there when the door opened. Serafina entered without knocking, which was characteristic. She was beautiful in the way certain weapons were beautiful, consciously, efficiently, with the specific aesthetic of a thing designed to do damage. She stood in the doorway of the washroom in ivory silk with the silver eyes of her bloodline, and she held a folded letter in one hand that Maria recognized, at 20 feet, as Aldric's most recent assessment of the king's condition. She dropped it on the floor. "You already know," Serafina said. "Don't you?" "Get out," Maria said. "I thought you should see it in writing." She looked down at the letter with the expression of someone viewing a landscape from a safe distance. 7 days, Aldric estimates. Maybe 10 if the fever holds off another cycle. And then Ethelgard loses its king. Her silver eyes came up. "Because of you. Get out." "Because of what you are." She said it the way Valerius had said creatures, lightly, precisely, without heat. Heat would have been easier. Every village that's ever burned down something it didn't understand. They were right, weren't they? Look what you've done. Look at him. The ash veil. Maria was 12, running through the dark, with the whole village behind her, and her mother's voice still in her ears, and the torches reflected in the river as she hit the water. The sound of them calling her monster. The particular quality of a child learning, very quickly, that monster was a word people used to justify whatever they were about to do. They were right, Serafina said, and left. Maria sat on the washroom floor for a while longer. Then she stood up, straightened her dress, and went to find Sir Tristan. Chapter 6. The Merciful Lie. She found him in the armory, alone, maintaining his kit with the focused calm she'd observed in him for 3 years. The stillness of a man who'd trained himself out of unnecessary movement. He looked up when she came in. She said, "I need you to tell me what you know about the Forbidden Forest." Tristan set down the whetstone. His eyes, gray, assessing, the eyes of a man who'd spent years watching the king and understood that the people near him were worth understanding, measured her face. "That's a conversation," he said. "That depends on what you're planning to do with the answer." "There's an archivist," she said, "or there was, 40 years ago. A scholar named Brennan, who documented chimera toxicology. If any of his work survived—" "Maria." He said her name with a weight that meant, "I know more than I've said." "The forest seals at the second moon. You'd have a 6-day window." "That's enough." "What does the king know about this plan?" "Nothing," she said, "and he won't." Tristan looked at her for a long time. She met his gaze and did not look away, because this was important, and she needed him to see that she understood exactly what she was asking. "I'll know," he said finally, "about the forest, when you come back." She nodded. "And if you don't come back?" "Then I was never going to be able to cure him anyway," she said. "And at least he's rid of us both." She went to Aldric that evening. The king's chamber had the low, warm quality of rooms where fever has been living for a few days. The fire built up high, the windows shut against the winter air, the physician's herbs burning in the corner brazier. Aldric was at his desk rather than in bed, because that was exactly the kind of man he was, and he looked up when she came in, with the specific attention he always had for her, the focus that had been, for 3 years, the most dangerous thing in her daily life. She did not allow herself to look at him properly. She looked at his collar, his hands, the desk in front of him. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand." "Maria?" "I've been calculating," she said, and the voice she used was the new one, the one she'd been building since the washroom floor, cold and clean, and with a kind of forward momentum that didn't leave room for interruption. "You've given me access, over the past months, to resources I wouldn't otherwise have had. Influence, respect, from people who wouldn't have accorded it to a physician's assistant. I want you to know that I'm aware of what I've been doing with that." He was very still. "I needed a platform," she said. "You were the most efficient one available. The people who had made my life difficult at this court, after your public declarations, they stopped. That was useful to me." She kept her eyes on the wall. "I want you to understand that when I stayed, that was why I stayed. I'm a practical person. I don't—" She stopped, started again. "I don't think you're stupid enough to believe I felt—" "Stop." His voice was quiet. She felt the quality of it in her sternum. Not loud, but somehow resonant. The voice she'd heard him use in council rooms, when he was working very hard not to demonstrate the full extent of what he was feeling. "Look at me," he said. She looked at the wall. "Maria." She looked at him, his face. God, his face. She had done this. The careful, neutral control of it, the jaw locked, the eyes that had been warm and direct and entirely too perceptive, now flat, was something that was not anger, but was what anger became once it had no more energy to spend. She said nothing. She was still saying nothing when he stood up, slowly, and said, "Leave," with the quiet that was worse than any other tone she had ever heard from him. She left. In the corridor, she put her back against the cold stone wall and pressed both hands over her mouth, and stayed there until she was certain she could walk without her knees betraying the exercise. Then she walked to the east gate, past the guards who had grown accustomed to her movements at odd hours, and through it, and into the dark mouth of the forbidden forest, as the second moon began to rise. She was inside for 4 days. The forest was alive in the way old things were alive, not hostile exactly, but indifferent to human survival in a way that amounted to much the same thing. The archive she found on the 3rd day, half swallowed by roots and ice, the text within sealed in waxed leather, Brennan's cramped handwriting still legible after 40 years in the cold. She read through the night by firelight. The chimera's toxin was extractable. She had read this in fragments before, but here it was in full. The creature itself carries in its appendage a dual property, both the venom and its reverse. The same barb that poisons also draws poison out, if the will and the concentration are sufficient. The forest tested her twice. The first time, with a cold, simple terror, the kind with teeth. The second time, with something quieter, the kind that settles in when the adrenaline is gone and you're sitting in the dark alone, and the thing you're afraid of is your own nature. She failed the first test and passed it a minute later. She passed the second test outright. When she came out of the forest on the 4th day, she knew what she was. She had always known in the abstract. But knowing in the abstract was different from the thing in the forest, which had no abstract in it at all. Just the cold and the old archive and the fact of herself, crouched in the dark, working. She was a chimera. Her venom could kill. Her venom could also, if she chose, and if the concentration held, draw poison out. She was going back into the palace. Chapter 7. The Trap in Parliament. She came in through the physician's gate at dawn, 4 days after she'd left, carrying the archive texts wrapped in oilskin inside her satchel. Seraphina's soldiers found her in the east corridor before she'd walked 30 feet. There were 6 of them, which she considered slightly insulting, given that she'd just survived 4 days in the Forbidden Forest. But she also hadn't slept in 22 hours, and the meadowsweet she'd gathered on the way back was doing nothing for the stiffness in her legs. So perhaps Seraphina had better intelligence than she'd credited. They took the satchel. They took the oilskin. They took the herbs. They did not, and this was the thing she held onto while they marched her down the corridor toward Parliament, take the knowledge she'd read 4 nights ago in the archive by firelight. That was inside her. That had a different kind of lock on it. Parliament's Great Hall, in morning light, looked different than it did in the prologue memory she'd been living in for the past hour. The torchlight hadn't yet been lit, and the gray winter sun came in at a shallow angle through the high northern windows, giving the space the cold clarity of a verdict. Valerius was already there. So was most of the court. So, on his throne, pale, upright, the line of his jaw sharp with something that might have been concentration, or might have been the sheer stubbornness of a man refusing to admit how close to the edge he was Aldric. Their eyes met across the distance. He said nothing. His hands were white on the throne arms. She was brought to the center of the floor and put on her knees. Valerius descended the dais steps with the gilded chalice. "The court of Ethelgard does not tolerate deception," he began, and she was barely hearing the words because she was watching Aldric, watching the fever sweat on his collar, watching the controlled, precise way he held himself upright through what she knew was considerable pain, and thinking, "You absolute idiot. You could have stayed in bed. You didn't have to." The chalice touched her lip. She thought, "This is going to hurt." She drank. 3 heartbeats. Then the pain arrived, complete and total, and her back opened like a door she'd been keeping locked for 23 years. The wings came out with a sound like a ship's sails catching wind. Someone screamed. The court's 300 swords came out in one terrible chord. Maria raised her head, in her ruined dress, in her true form, white mane standing on end and tail raised, and 12 feet of dragon-pale wings casting shadow across the floor, and found Alric's eyes across the hall. He was rising from his throne. She gazed at him, said, "Don't." His gaze said, "Watch me." He took 3 steps toward her, and his knees buckled. "Aldric." She heard herself make a sound she'd never made in human form. Low, resonant, the warning vibration of a very large animal watching someone it was attached to go down. And then chaos descended on Parliament's Great Hall, because this was the first time any of them had heard a chimera speak. Chapter 8. Salvation. Valerius moved fast, for a man in ceremonial robes. He had, apparently, prepared for contingencies. From somewhere inside his coat came a second vial, and this one went into the king's wine cup, where it had been sitting untouched on the throne's armrest. And by the time Aldric hit the floor on one knee, and Sir Tristan moved to support him, whatever was in the vial had already been absorbed. "Second dosing," Valerius said, to no one in particular, in case the chimera's venom somehow failed to complete its work. "Belt and suspenders." Seraphina smiled and reached into the guard's confiscated satchel and found the oilskin-wrapped herbs and looked directly at Maria and dropped them on the stone floor and placed her heel on them. The crunch of dried meadowsweet and wolfsbane bark under silk was very quiet. Very quiet. The hall had gone still, with the specific stillness of a crowd that doesn't know which way a very large animal is about to move. Maria was aware of 30 crossbow quarrels aimed at her center mass, of the guards in a ring at 10 feet, of Seraphina's satisfied expression, of the soldiers circling Aldric where he'd gone down on the floor. She was aware of Aldric's voice, low, urgent, saying something to Tristan she couldn't hear. She was aware of Valerius beginning to speak to the court, his voice warm with reasonableness. She was aware that she had 4 minutes, perhaps 6, before the secondary venom reached Aldric's heart. She had no herbs. She had the knowledge from the archive. She had her own venom, and the capacity, demonstrated once in the forest on a dead rabbit, because she'd needed to be certain, to reverse it. She had not tried it on a living human. She had not tried it on a human at all. She had never tried it under the observation of 300 people, 4 minutes before a deadline, with a crossbow quarrel embedded in her left wing, where someone had fired without instruction, because people did that when they were frightened, and she couldn't blame them, and it was beginning to burn. "You don't need the herbs," she thought. "You are the herb." She moved. The ring of guards held for exactly as long as it took her to demonstrate what 12 feet of wings looked like in motion, and then the ring became considerably less ring-shaped. She covered the distance across the hall in the time it took Seraphina to turn, and the expression on Seraphina's face as Maria's foreleg swept her sideways, not crushing, not killing, just moved, was a thing she would, she thought, remember. Tristan had Aldric, had gotten him on his back on the floor, which was the right instinct, giving him stable surface and keeping his airway clear. "Maria," Aldric said, and his voice was paper-thin but present. "Don't," she said, and it came out in the low register she was still getting used to, the resonance of the form she'd spent 23 years pretending wasn't hers. "Don't talk. Don't move." She brought the barbed tip of her tail to his chest, above the heart. "This is going to hurt," she said. "Less than dying. I need you to hold still." Tristan's hand moved toward his sword. Maria met his eyes over Alric's body, and he stilled. "Trust her," Aldric said from the floor. 3 heartbeats of silence in the Great Hall of Parliament, with 300 people watching. Then Tristan moved his hand away from his sword. She pressed the tip to the skin above his heart and concentrated. The technique from the archive involved 2 parts: the draw, which was physical, and the hold, which was the part she'd only understood on her 4th night in the forest, sitting with the cold and her own nature. The venom she drew had to go somewhere. It went back into her, which was survivable. Chimera toxin could not harm its source. Both venoms, Alric's blood was carrying 2 poisons, and she had to draw them both at once. And the concentration required was the kind that left no room for monitoring what the court was doing around her, what crossbows were being reloaded, what Valerius was or wasn't saying. She found the chimera toxin first, recognized it like a known voice in a crowd. Then the second one, Valerius's compound, unfamiliar but traceable. Both of them, together, through the barb, drawn back, into her. The burn traveled up her tail, into her spine, and spread from there with the enthusiasm of something that had just been released from containment. It was, she noted remotely, quite bad. She did not let this be relevant. Hold, she thought. Hold, hold, hold. Then Aldric breathed. Not the shallow, fighting breath of the last 3 days. A deep breath. The kind that meant the lungs were receiving what they were supposed to receive. Then another one. His color. She watched his face, watched the gray drain back from it like something retreating, changed. She removed the barb. She sat back on her haunches, which placed her approximately 12 feet tall in the middle of Parliament's floor, surrounded by a circle of very silent nobility, with the drawn toxin now doing something complicated to her nervous system. And she held herself upright through it, because this was not the moment to fall. Aldric's eyes opened. The fever-dull quality was gone. His eyes were clear and present, and incandescent in the way she'd first understood what alpha meant. Not rank, exactly, but the particular quality of a person whose will was so completely themselves that it radiated outward. He looked at her. She looked at him. "There," she said, still in the low register. "You're fine. Tristan, if you wouldn't mind." She folded, not catastrophically. More of a controlled settling, wings coming in, hindquarters down, the trembling beginning in her extremities now that the concentration had released. She was vaguely aware of Tristan shouting for the king's physician, vaguely aware of the sounds of the court behind her as Tristan's Highlanders, the ones she had tipped off 3 days ago before entering the forest, moved to seal the exits. She was mostly aware of the stone floor, which was cold, and then of Aldric's hand on the side of her face. Enormous on her face in this form. Both of them were rather large in different ways. The mathematical absurdity of this briefly occurred to her. And his voice. "I have you," he said. "I have you. You can stop now." She stopped. Chapter 9. The Monster Queen and Her King. She came back to human form, slowly, the way you return to a room you've been away from for a long time. Not re-entering, so much as settling, finding the familiar dimensions again. The great hall resolved around her, piece by piece. The torchlight now lit, the afternoon having moved, the stone floor beneath her knees. She was in her human body. Her dress was destroyed. She was shaking in the specific way that followed extreme effort, the kind of trembling that came up from the bones. She kept her eyes closed. Around her, the hall was very quiet. She could hear breathing, 300 people breathing, and beneath it the rustle and creak of a room that had been disrupted and had not yet decided what it was going to be next. "They will call me a monster," she thought. "They're standing there looking at what I am and deciding what name to use for it." She had heard this before. The torches at the ash veil. Her mother's voice. Run. The river and the cold and the long, careful years of building a human shape out of discipline and silence. She would hold still for it. She'd had practice. Footsteps, measured, unrushed, coming from the direction of the throne. She heard the rustle of formal fabric. She felt warmth settle over her shoulders. She opened her eyes. Aldric's ceremonial cloak covered her from shoulder to knee, the deep wool of it still body-warm. He had crouched in front of her, the Alpha King, in full court ceremony, on his knees on Parliament's floor. And he was looking at her with the same expression she'd catalogued in the herb stores, and in the frozen garden, and in the snow under the moonlight in the forest. the expression that saw her and was not looking for something else. He had not, she noticed, collapsed again. Whatever she'd drawn out of him had held. The fever hollows were still there, but the color was returning. The sharp clarity she associated with him restored. He slid an arm beneath her knees and stood up. She said reflexively, "I can walk." "I know," he said. He did not put her down. She was not going to make an argument out of it. The hall was, as she had noted, very quiet. Aldric turned with her in his arms to face his court, and the quality of the silence shifted, became something more attentive, the silence of a judgment being deferred to the person who held it. He looked at them. She looked at the ceiling, because she had made her peace with the outcome, and she didn't need to watch it happening. "My queen," Aldric said, "demonstrated greater courage, greater intelligence, and greater loyalty to this kingdom in the past 4 days than most of this court has managed in the past 4 years. His voice carried in the way it always carried, not loud, but absolute. If there is a person in this hall who has an objection to her nature, they may state it now. Silence. If there is a person in this hall who wishes to call her monster, he looked directly and deliberately at Seraphina, at Valerius, bracketed by Tristan's guard. They are welcome to also explain to me why a monster would take venom into her own body to cure a king who had been made an enemy by a lie she told to protect him. They're welcome to describe that as monstrous. I'll wait. The silence had texture to it now. She could feel it. 300 people calculating, reassessing, arriving at the particular destination that crowds arrived at when the most powerful person in the room had made his opinion unambiguous. Her wings, Aldric continued, and his voice had shifted into something quieter, the version of it she only heard in small rooms. And her tail, and her nature, they are the most extraordinary things in this kingdom. Anyone who disagrees has my sympathy, and their own ignorance for company. He turned from the court as if the matter were concluded. In a certain absolute sense, it was. "Sir Tristan," he said, "the Duke of Valerius and Lady Seraphina are to be conveyed to the northern garrison at Frostmark. They'll find the climate suits their temperament." "It will be done," Tristan said, and there was something in his voice, something almost warm, that Maria noted and filed away for later. She insisted on walking out. He let her, which was, she thought, one of the things she would remember about him. He set her down at the hall's threshold, and she walked, shaky, in ruins, in a borrowed cloak, through the doors of Parliament on her own feet, because this was the sort of thing that mattered to her, and he had understood that without being told. He walked beside her. Not behind her, not in front of her, beside her. The full ceremonial length of the corridor, with the court spreading away behind them, and Tristan managing the aftermath with efficient authority, and the pale winter afternoon visible through the tall end windows in stripes across the stone floor. "I lied to you," she said. "I know," he said. "I lied. Badly," she added. "You should have. It was obvious, and you—" "It was not obvious," he said, which was generous and probably not true. And then, "I wanted to believe it for approximately 4 hours. Then I thought about the way you looked at me when you said it." She considered this. And I sent Tristan to find out where you'd gone. He tracked you to the forest gate. He was very nearly incandescent. I left him a letter." He mentioned the letter. It did not reduce the incandescence significantly. She almost laughed. Almost. The thing that moved through her chest was close enough to it that her throat did something uncooperative, and she had to look at the window stripes on the floor for a moment to recover herself. The corridor was long. They walked it slowly. She was still shaking slightly in the legs, which she resented, and he was pacing himself to her pace, which she noticed and resented being aware of because it did things to the careful inventory she'd been maintaining for 3 years. "The ash veil," he said after a while. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "How old?" 7. She watched the floor. My mother got me to the river. They didn't follow that far. She didn't follow either. I don't know if she stopped. He said nothing. Beside her, his hand found hers. Not gripping, just present. His palm against hers in the simple, specific warmth of contact with a person who has decided to be there. She did not look at him. She did not pull away. They walked the rest of the corridor like that, her hand in his, the winter light moving across the floor between them, and she thought that she had been building human shapes out of silence for 23 years, and she was quite tired, and it was possible, she was recording this thought with the same clinical neutrality she applied to medical assessments, it was possible she did not have to do it alone. The wedding was held in the first week of spring. The palace opened both great gates, which had not been done simultaneously in 40 years. The city came. The outer villages came. The mountain settlements sent representatives who arrived in embroidered coats with their children on their shoulders to see over the crowd. Maria stood at the altar of the old stone chapel in a gown that had been made without a train. The seamstress had accommodated, at Alric's specific instruction, the 12 feet of wingspan. And she wore the queen's crown that had been resized and reset with materials that Aldric's most historically obsessive junior had identified as consistent with pre-human chimera royal regalia. He'd been ecstatic about it for 3 days. The crown was heavier than it looked. She stood straight under it. Alric stood opposite her. No ceremony armor. Plain dark wool, the crown he wore daily. The expression she'd first cataloged in the herb stores and had been cataloging ever since. Direct and present, and seeing her. "You're holding your breath," he said, low, meant for her. "I'm not," she said. "You've been holding your breath since the first candle." "That's medically improbable." "You're doing it right now." She exhaled. He smiled. The real one, not the one he performed for councils. The bishop was saying something. She was looking at Alric. He was looking at her. The crowd, the candles, the chapel walls, they receded to the edge of things. The crown was heavy. She was standing straight. "You don't have to," he said. "If it's too much, it's not too much," she said. His hand at her wrist turned over. An invitation, not a requirement. She put her hand in his. Valerius and Seraphina reached Frostmark in 3 weeks, traveling the northern road in a carriage without the ducal crest. The northern garrison was comfortable, in the utilitarian way of military establishments. Adequate food, adequate warmth, the excellent clarity of very cold air. It was, as Alric had predicted, entirely consistent with their temperament. No one came to hear their opinions about the queen's nature. No one asked. In the palace at Ethelgard, the physician's assistant's room was emptied, and the wing intended for the queen was opened for the first time in a generation. Aldric supervised the relocation of the herb stores personally, with the anxiety of a man who understood that the power structure had shifted in his favor and was somewhat alarmed by the responsibility this implied. Tristan found Maria in the old apothecary the night before the formal move, sitting on the work table with a jar of dried chamomile in both hands, and the look on her face that he had been developing a taxonomy for. "You're doing it again," he said. "What? The thing where you wait for something to turn out wrong?" She looked at the chamomile. The jar was warm in her hands. South-facing shelf. Afternoon sun had been on it for hours. Old habit. "You could replace it with a new one." She set the jar back on the shelf, carefully, in its place. "Such as?" He shrugged. "Trusting that you're allowed to be here." She was quiet for a moment. He said, she started and stopped. "I know what he said," Tristan said. "I was there." He crossed his arms, leaned on the doorframe in the way he'd been leaning on doorframes for as long as she'd known him. "I was also there for 3 years of watching him walk past the physician's quarters door at odd hours of the evening for no articulable reason." She looked at him. "You never said anything." "It wasn't my thing to say." He pushed off the doorframe. It is, however, my thing to note that the south corridor is better lit and the window in the apothecary opens toward the training yard. He paused, which is more information than you need and exactly as much as you deserve. Good night, my queen. He left. His footsteps went down the corridor and turned at the landing, and then the palace was quiet in the way it was quiet at the end of the day, which was different from the way it was quiet in the middle of the night. Inhabited rather than empty. The difference between a room with someone in it and a room that was merely waiting. She stood in the old apothecary for a while. Then she went to find Aldric. Not because she needed to. Not because it was required. Because the old habit, the holding still, the waiting for something to turn wrong, the careful daily maintenance of a human shape built from silence, had a different kind of weight to it now. And she was, as she had told him 4 months ago, in the snow with her back against a fallen oak and the moonlight turning everything honest, a practical person. She walked through the south corridor, past the better-lit windows, and found him at the end of the hallway, looking out at the last of the evening sky, still in the plain dark wool, without the crown, which was on the window ledge beside him, because he was that kind of man. He heard her footsteps and turned. She stopped in the doorway. He looked at her with the expression she'd spent 3 years cataloging, the one she'd finally let herself name, somewhere in the cold of the forbidden forest, in the small hours of the 4th night, with Brennan's archive open on her knee, and the old scholar's cramped handwriting describing, in a 100-year-old text, the nature of the chimera. Not 2 things at war, but 2 things in accord, and only the creature itself can determine which. The crown on the windowsill caught the last light, heavy, old, hers. "You didn't go to the south wing," he said. "I will," she said, "tomorrow, but not tonight." Not tonight. The evening had that quality. Full winter leaving, the kind of almost warmth that arrived in false starts before spring decided to commit. She could smell pine resin and wood smoke, and underneath those, the cold stone scent of the palace, which was home in the way that places became home, without your permission. He was looking at her in the way that had stopped being catalogable. "Maria," he said. "I know," she said. She crossed the threshold. In the kingdom of Ethelgard, in the years that followed, they wrote many things about the reign of the monster queen and her king, about the chimera banner that flew over Parliament, about the cures her particular medical talents made possible, about the general improvement in the political climate once Valerius was removed from it. They wrote less, in official records, about the king who walked down the south corridor at odd hours, for no articulable reason, or the queen who left meadowsweet on his desk when his headaches were bad, or the specific quality of the silence in the great hall when they sat together at the high table, and the room arranged itself, unconsciously, around the fact of them. Some things needed no recording. They already knew. Maria spent 23 years believing the most dangerous thing about her was what she was. Not who she was. What? A creature. A monster. Something to be burned out of villages and hidden from daylight. She built her life in the margins, small, quiet, careful, convinced that the only way to survive was to take up as little space as possible, to be useful, to be forgettable, to never, under any circumstances, let anyone see the wings. And then a king knelt in the snow and asked her to stay. Not the wolf, not the bloodline, not the version of her that passed. Her. This story isn't really about politics, or poison, or a gilded chalice in a cold stone hall. It's about the particular exhaustion of hiding, the cost of performing smallness for so long that you forget what standing upright feels like. It's about the terrifying moment when someone looks at the thing you've been most afraid to show and doesn't flinch. The lesson Maria carries isn't that love conquers all. It's quieter than that. It's that the parts of you that have been called monstrous, the parts you folded away and apologized for and kept out of the light, those are often the exact parts capable of the most extraordinary things. Her venom was the poison. Her venom was also the cure. She was both, always. She just needed to stop treating that as a contradiction. You are not too much. You are not the wrong kind of creature for the room you're standing in. You're just in the wrong room. If this story hit something in you, drop a comment below. Tell me which moment got you, or just say hi. I genuinely read every single one, and hearing from you is what makes me want to keep building these stories. If you want more, a like takes 2 seconds and means more than you'd think. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for being here. Really. End.